Do you want to make an announcement also for next week's? Okay, cool. What is next week? On April 9th, the guest speaker.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's right. I am organizing that.
It's hard to, look, you're not alone. It's hard to keep track sometimes.
Yeah, they bump into my email, which is good. I'm like, oh. Yeah.
It's really good to know this published site.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hey man, hey, how are you?
At this point. I guess you could say that there
I'm
is.
digging the socks, birds. It's you know, it's rare for that to really work in this climate, but I feel like if there's a day for it, it's today. This weather's been all over the map. Yep.
As long as it doesn't open up.
Nice.
It can work in the colder scenic weather.
Well, it is. So I don't know.
I'll consider it.
Yeah, consider it. That's probably better.
Anything new at your house?
Oh yeah, body hurts all the time now.
Constantly doing shit.
Totally demolished the super crappy addition.
Nice.
And then hauled it all into one of those huge city
Dump.
trash container things. We had them drop off in front.
Nice. Bunch of your neighbors throw a bunch of other shit in there too.
Oh, really? I mean, there were some like stray
Like,
all toys,
we asked
different alcoholic beverages, people on walks, toss
Chuck
it
it
over
in
into
there.
there. But no,
something
and
we're gonna use, or like, that it requires somebody to accept people to come in. Right now, it's just whatever Zoom link ESU provides, so it's, I'm guessing it's open.
NEH fellowship application,
Again, I think.
NEH endowment for the humanities. Hey.
Okay, to get started.
Yeah, that's good. Right. So, good morning, everybody. I think majority of you know me, but I'm Dr. Stephanie Arbiza, assistant professor in the School of Complex Adaptive Systems and also in the Thunderbird School of Global Management. And I will be giving a presentation on some of the work I've been doing, which is on carbon management. And on this topic, I also would like to let you know there will be another seminar next week. We have Asha presenting her thesis defense on some of the items we'll be discussing today. And we will have also an external guest coming in, attorney of environmental law. Her name is Jessica Nachman. And she'll be speaking about some of the legal issues that I'll be touching on today. So those are happening next week, Wednesday, at 10 and at 1 p.m. So if you want more information, please let me know. But today we're going to be talking about designing a carbon management system, the progress and some of the challenges to date. And I will start with this visual. What it's showing is that every year we add a cube 7 kilometers of length to this enormous pile of carbon dioxide that we have been producing since 1750. This is equivalent to a pyramid that's 120 kilometers tall and 190 kilometers wide. So this is enormous. And every year we add a block of 7 kilometers. This addition of carbon dioxide to the environment is, of course, causing climate change. And last year we saw global temperatures exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius for the first time. And this can be shown here on this graph from the European agency Copernicus. And basically every relevant meteorological organizations have now confirmed that this has been the case. And of course, you might remember that 1.5 degrees Celsius was the temperature limit we had all committed to under the Paris Agreement. This rise in temperature is, of course, causing some of the extreme climate events that we have been witnessing more frequently in the last decade or so, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. But while there are these negative consequences to that pile of CO2 trash that we put in the atmosphere, there is actually an opportunity underneath it all. And this is the opportunity of cleaning up that pile of trash. So this is the business case for it. It is trillions of dollars worth of carbon management, of which the current size is minuscule compared to its potential. We are investing and benefiting for about $2 billion globally, and some consultants are expecting this to grow to $1 trillion. Annually, yes. Now, what this pile of trash really tells us is that we only have 3 options when we want to deal with, about carbon with carbon management. And our options are: we must either avoid emitting in the first place, so avoid adding to the pile of trash. We can also add to the pile of trash, but remove it. And so this is the concept of net zero that has been advanced in international law. And then we can also reduce the pile of trash that's already in the environment, and that's negative emissions. And when we talk about negative emissions, we're talking about dealing with those legacy or historical emissions. So carbon management is really this intervention to clean up the carbon pollution and additionally move towards a circular carbon economy through that idea of net zero. Carbon management is a set of strategies and practices that are used to manage carbon, and this will include technologies that can measure, technologies that can reuse carbon, capture carbon, and store carbon. And while some authors consider emission avoidance to be part of carbon management, I consider it an indirect consequence of managing carbon, for reasons that will become apparent later. Now, this problem of CO2 into the atmosphere has been contextualized and reframed as a problem of waste. This was done by several authors, but the idea is that we have added this pile of trash in the environment and now we can manage it. And when it comes to the waste analogy, some of the questions we might be asking are: what are the features of this waste management system? Oh, sorry, this is in the wrong order. What are the features of this management system? What drives management? We might also be asking questions like, my recycling gets recycled, right? And how leaky is the system? And these questions can now apply to carbon management, and this is how I will structure the rest of this talk. So let me walk you through some of the features of a global carbon management system and give you a bit of a status report. So as I mentioned, we have technologies that are required for global carbon management to reuse, capture, store, and measure. But then we also have socioeconomic systems that are necessary for this carbon management industry to even operate. And here we're talking about standards, we're talking about the buyers, innovation policy, the workforce, and the public. And I'll touch briefly on many of those in the following. Starting off with the technologies. The main form of technology to know about is technologies that capture CO2 from the environment. And here, the colloquial name for this is carbon dioxide removal, or carbon removal for short. These types of technologies can be broken down into two categories. One would be what are called conventional carbon removal. And here you might think about technologies like afforestation, reforestation, the restoration of ecosystems. These have been described as conventional. Locally, we have examples of this. For example, the Forest Restoration Initiative. Part of the reason for doing so is restoring the forests so that they would be less prone to fires, which would be releasing the carbon into the atmosphere. The other type of carbon removal are more novel. So that's the other category. And here you might be considering technologies like direct air capture, of which we have our very own on campus. If you haven't seen it yet, it's next to the light rail in that red kind of fencing area. And these technologies are using chemical and physical means to capture CO2. And they do not as much rely on the biotic systems. Carbon removal projects are proliferating around the world. This is a map that shows possibly just a fraction of them. We don't have very good data for the Asian countries and Australia. But as you can see, there are very many projects of carbon removal right now. And in total, carbon removal has already sequestered about 2 billion tons of CO2 just in 2024. Now, the vast majority of that 2 billion tons is actually from conventional carbon removal, so all of the forest and the restoration of ecosystems, and a very small proportion is from those novel carbon removal technologies like direct air capture. But as you can see, we are already doing quite a bit of it. Now, another set of technologies that fit within carbon management is the idea of capturing CO2 that comes out of power plants or other industrial sources. This is often referred to as point source capture and storage. Sometimes it's called CCS. But the idea is that you have a supply of fossil fuels to some form of industrial process, let's say a coal power plant, and on this coal power plant, you have a carbon capture technology. The CO2 that's captured is then piped to a storage reservoir. And here we're seeing one particular case where it is piped and shipped to these offshore platforms, and it is then injected very, very deep under the seafloor. One example of this particular type of technology is the Sleipner gas field, which has been in operation since 1996 and has already sequestered 1 million tons of carbon per year since then. There are quite a few CCS projects worldwide, again, mostly centered in the US and in Europe. And at present, we are capturing about 40 million tons of CO2 per year globally. Now, the carbon can also be used in products. It doesn't have to just go into disposal, even though the majority of the carbon will have to go into disposal. Some of it can be used in useful products. You may think about using CO2 from the air to make fuels or chemicals or building materials, or to use in other processes. The current scale of utilization is quite small. We're talking about 250 million tons per year in 2023, and it is expected to rise, to continue increasing. The majority of that CO2 is actually used to produce fertilizer, and the other significant portion is actually used to push out more oil. So there is some contradiction in some of the tests or the use cases of carbon utilization. Now, the other type of technology necessary are measurement systems, so ways to track carbon throughout this entire chain. And here we're talking about mostly carbon accounting and the standards that this carbon accounting relies on. There are multiple scales at which this can be done, from the global to the national, to the organization, to the individual. And each scale requires a different type of system to make it work. This is what the system looks like for carbon removal technologies. What you're seeing here in the blue band are all the different organizations that have created standards for carbon removal, of which there are over 30 organizations. They have produced over 150 different standards to do carbon accounting for carbon removal. And this kind of situation is also evident when we're talking about other aspects of the carbon management system. So if you're thinking about global scale accounting, personal accounting, they all have multiple carbon accounting methods available. So hopefully, now that you've seen what these technologies entail and the various facets that will come into play into deploying them, you might get a sense that very diverse actors are already involved in this management system. We're talking from NGOs to governments to private sector and everything in between. And as you can imagine, each of these actors also have their own priorities and motivations in how the system should run. And this leads us to the question of what drives waste management, which is fundamental to the carbon management. When we look at the analogy of waste management, we see that historically it becomes a necessity as population grows in a particular location. And the environment no longer can absorb the amount of waste that the population is producing. We can think back and look at New York in the 1800s, where the streets were absolutely filled with horse manure, so much so that people thought this was an environmental apocalypse, and it is the car that actually cleaned up the city. We can also think about what was happening in London in the 1950s with the London smog, which caused millions of deaths. Now, both of these are examples of the environment no longer being able to absorb the amount of waste produced. The other two observations we can draw from the waste management analogy is that waste management is never free. There's always somebody that pays for it, whether that be through financial means or because we are enslaving people to collect the trash. So there is always some kind of payment. Waste management is also not done voluntarily. It requires regulation. And this has been shown time and time again throughout history. For example, the sanitation reforms in the 1900s actually required regulation to stop people from throwing their trash in the street and to throw their human waste in the backyard. And what these regulations actually did was revoke the right to dump. It was no longer legal to dump the waste. Now, when we talk about recycling, of course, that is still voluntary in many locations, but this is also rapidly changing. And what we are seeing is that as countries move up the development levels and become wealthier, there is greater emphasis on a cleaner environment because now the means make it possible to think about our environment, right? At lower development levels, we think about sustaining ourselves, right, with food and shelter. And as countries develop and get more money and have more space to think about other things, the environment becomes more and more important. Now, if we apply all of this to carbon management, we are seeing a industry that's mostly run by volunteers. So we have these volunteering organizations, volunteering people who are paying for carbon management in some form. Now, this was very good PR, right? It looks very good to be trying to do something good for the environment, and therefore it paid for itself. The major current buyers of carbon removal are mostly software and professional service companies like Microsoft, but they also include fossil fuel companies, right? So we are starting to see a bit of a diversification of buyers. Now, the government is heavily involved in carbon management, but mostly through conventional removal. Very few frameworks currently include novel technologies, but this is starting to expand. The industry, and I'm talking about mostly fossil fuels, cement, fertilizers, they are heavily invested in CCS, but they don't want to pay for it. So they're hoping the governments will foot the bill for the research and development and other investments. And this is what we are seeing, for example, in the US with the tax credits. Now, some of the research has suggested that the level of carbon management that will be necessary for our climate goals would result in consuming 1/3 of general government expenditures in advanced economies if the buyer of carbon management was to be the government, right? So we're talking about significant restructuring of where money is going to. Now we can take a look at how much carbon removal costs. And right now, the weighted average price, at least for 2024, was around $300 per ton, but this greatly varied between different types of technologies, with some technologies more on the closer to 100 and some well over 1,000. Now, there is expectation that these prices would come down the learning curve, but we are not quite there yet. And the other part we are seeing is that we are already hitting the limits of what voluntary carbon management looks like. There are now fewer new buyers entering this space. And yeah, so there's fewer new voluntary buyers entering the space. Some consultants expect that by really pushing it, we could reach something like 800 million tons per year if we expand in Asia. But the goal is orders of magnitude smaller. The present situation, sorry, is orders of magnitude smaller than the goal. So what this tells us is that relying on the voluntary system is not going to cut it. So a lot of work has been put into identifying what could be some of the policy and legal frameworks to enable such a carbon management system. And the one that I'm going to particularly focus on is this one, highlighted in red, which has been the focus of most of my research. So what are we talking about here? This policy basically connects supply to demand through something called an expanded producer responsibility. So let me explain this to you. Right now, when we purchase energy, and if that energy is fossil energy, we are paying for extraction, transport, and processing, and some rent, right? So this is what constitutes the cost of fossil energy. Now, if we were to put a fourth pillar into that price cost, into that business operation, we would be paying for carbon management. And the way this policy would look like is that for every ton of carbon extracted from fossil fuel operations, the cost of sequestration would be added on, and this would be on a one-to-one situation. This has been socialized under the name carbon take-back obligation, and the seminar next week that Asha is going to be defending at, Asha explores a carbon take-back obligation for the US specific case. Now, why do we call this an extended producer responsibility? We call it that because the fossil fuel industry would pay for essentially the waste management of the products that they are selling to us. There is plenty of evidence that these types of policies work. We even have some in Arizona. For example, if you change the car battery, you are paying for a fee. That fee is paying for the recycling of the car battery. This is the same thing, but we're expanding it to the whole fossil fuel system. And one of the major benefits of such a policy is that not only would it start up a carbon management industry, but it would also mean that everybody who purchases fossil fuels will be carbon neutral, not just the people who can afford to switch to EVs or switch to renewable energy. It is everybody. It would also have the benefits that it would make fossil fuels more expensive and indirectly possibly influence behavior to switch to non-fossil fuel energy and products. So that's ongoing work that I've been pushing. Now, a question that often gets brought up when I talk about carbon management is that, well, when we think about recycling, does my recycling even get recycled, right? There is that skepticism that recycling even works. So let me give you some information about that because it really applies to carbon management. So when we actually look at recycling, what the evidence is telling us is that 60% of the plastic that has been collected for recycling does get recycled. So this is a significant share. Of course, it's not 100%, but it's still pretty significant. Now, some of the headlines have been talking about the fact that only 5 to 15% of plastics are even collected in the first place. So this is a small amount of plastic that does get recycled, but it does have some pertinent connections with carbon management, because a lot of the conversations that have been happening in recent years is around this question of, are my carbon credits real? And unlike recycling, here we actually have quite an issue, because recent studies have suggested that less than 20% may be real. If we look at studies that looked at afforestation, reforestation projects in the Amazon set by the voluntary market, only 10% of those credits were deemed to be real. If we look at the Clean Development Mechanism, which is run by the United Nations, only 50% of those might be real. And when we looked at the California regulated market, only 70% of those may be real. So we do see a progression of more real when we're talking about regulation, right? But we're still kind of low efficiency when it comes to the system. Now, to understand why this is happening, we need to understand some of the underlying systems that create those credits. So what we have is that we have people who want to do some kind of carbon project. So think about making a direct air capture project, or maybe they're doing afforestation, or maybe restoration. And they set up this project, and then they go to a standard developing organization who will have a standard, a carbon accounting methodology to determine the carbon outcome of the project. Okay, so the project applies this measurement technique, and They then apply for certification by another entity. This other entity says, yes, you followed the protocol, and here is your credit. The credit then goes on some platform or some carbon market situation, and there is somebody on the other end who wants to purchase it because they want to make some kind of claim about their environmental action. Okay, so this is how it works. Now, there are a couple of points in this chain where the problems start to occur. And I have been spending a lot of my research on identifying those points of entry. One of them is that the projects that are allowed to enter the system are not carefully vetted for the purpose of being verifiable. So a lot of projects that come in, they seem to be good, they seem to do good, and so they are allowed, and then a methodology is developed to try and make them work. Like there is a decision process that does not vet what the project is going to be doing and what can and cannot actually be measured. It is very possible to have a perfectly good project that is simply impossible to measure. And because carbon credits are based on measurements, they simply should not be allowed into the system. But this has not been the case so far. A second point of entry is in the standards, so the protocols to calculate the carbon outcome. And here I have identified a few aspects that are creating this entry for manipulation. And here I'm talking about the fact that every organization has its own methodology. Sometimes you can have 10, 15 methodologies for the same type of system. So for example, there are 12 methodologies available online for carbon accounting for forests of the same type. Right? You can pick and choose which one is going to work the best for you. Each standard looks different, right? So you can really choose what you want the outcome to be. And when you pick the standard, the types of practices that it contains are oftentimes very complicated, relying on counterfactual and modeling. And this leaves a lot of room for manipulation because of the size of the uncertainty that gets introduced into the carbon accounting. And then there is this whole can of worms that is happening because this entire system has been built for credits of emission reduction. And this system hasn't been built for carbon management. And as a result, some of the problems are baked in. They are part of the DNA of the system. Now, others have also identified immense conflicts of interest in this chain, where the certifier is also the standard developer, is also the seller. And the conflicts of interest here are enormous financially. And so through these points of entry, we have a system that is basically built to not be robust. Now, some of the work that I've been doing on trying to assess how pertinent or how pervasive, this problem might be is through this network analysis that was part of the second edition of the State of Carbon Dioxide Removal Report. And what I did is that I looked at every standard that exists for carbon removal, and I tried to find upon which standard it was developed. So you have a standard, and in it they say, well, we developed the standard to be aligned with this other standard. And usually the other standard is a more established, more respected standard, and therefore by association, they could get more traction or more buyers. Now, when you actually follow this chain, you start to identify 5 very important standards, which are highlighted in those big boxes. And the ones that are now gray are the ones that were involved in some of the investigations that showed that the carbon credits were not real. when we actually calculate how many of the standards this might apply to, that's 70% of the entire system. Right? So if only 20% of carbon credits are real, and this applies to 70% of the whole system for carbon management, we're in big trouble. This is potentially a house of cards that's just waiting to tumble. So some of the work I've been advancing over the last couple of years is to try and identify what could be a system that is purpose-built for carbon management, for the purpose of actually managing the carbon globally. And so some of our research have led us to develop some new frameworks and principles to try and have universal method-agnostic principles that can apply to any technology, that simplifies the carbon accounting and reduces the possibility of manipulation. At this point, we are currently in the phase where we are trying to develop some of the process that underlies the decision-making of these principles and the ways we will be vetting projects and the ways we will be deciding on whether a project can move ahead and be part of the system. And this is work that my postdoc, Victor, which is sitting right here, is helping me advance and test, because we don't know if we're right with these principles, right? And we want to find where the holes and the problems are so that we can make a system that's as tight as possible. And so with Victor's help, we are applying some of the learnings that we have developed on different types of carbon removal. One is ocean iron fertilization, which we had a guest talk on about. So this is a form of marine carbon removal. It involves spreading iron on the oceans and hoping that biotic systems will bloom and sink and trap carbon in the water column. So we're exploring that. And then we're also exploring saline aquifers as a reservoir. And this we're doing the northern part of Arizona, where there is a complex stack system of geological storage that's been developed by the Department of Energy. Okay, so now I've described to you what a system could look like, what the technologies are, what the measurement techniques would need to be. The next question that often comes up when I talk about all this is that how leaky is this going to be? And when you think about waste and waste management, people often will say, well, we are producing so much trash and we are mismanaging it so badly that it all ends up in the oceans, right? We are not good at waste management, so why would we be good at carbon waste management? And so that's a fair question and we should consider it. So when we look at how good we are at waste management generally, I was able to find some data about plastic waste management. And here we see that about 23% of the total plastic waste is mismanaged. And that's on the order of 110 million tons per year. Now, the mismanagement is oftentimes leaking into the environment, the rivers and coasts, and about 0.5% actually ends up into the oceans. Now, of course, waste that you can see, plastic waste, right? Because you can see it, it is more striking. CO2, we cannot see it, and that's why I've created that big pyramid of trash to show you how massive the problem is compared to plastic pollution. So we should be working on this. So the point here, though, is that there is mismanagement in the waste system. So how does this apply to carbon management? So to understand the possibility of carbon leaking from the carbon management system, we have to think about the reservoirs, right? So when we do carbon capture, we move carbon from the air or from the environment into some form of reservoir. And by reservoir, I mean the oceans, or I mean the trees or a rock, right? So it is the receptacle that actually stores that CO2. Now, what you then might think about is, well, each one of those reservoir types have an inherent ability to retain carbon. Right? You might imagine that a tree is less durable than a rock, right? And that's pretty intuitive. Well, when we talk about carbon storage in these reservoirs, we can look at the data that tells us how long these reservoirs, on average, might store carbon. And so this is work that I have been leading for several years now, and with multiple students involved. And we have been collecting data from different types of carbon storage around the world. So these are mostly natural analogs, right? We are actually not looking at human-made reservoirs. We're looking at analogs in the Earth system. But what we can see is that when we talk about conventional types, so this is for the biotic systems, we are talking on the order of thousands to maybe tens of thousands of years for soil carbon. Of course, products are much more short-lived. And then when we're talking about novel techniques, here we can start to extend into the millions of years. So what you can see from this is that not every technology is going to store carbon for the same amount of time. And the problem with that is that when carbon goes into the natural system, the natural carbon cycle system, this cycle is extremely slow to get rid of it. So what this table is showing us is that it will take upwards of 190,000 years for the CO2 to get out of the system and back into the lithosphere, right? So this is incredibly slow. And because it is incredibly slow, it means that CO2 is piling up. And so that's the reason why we have this pileup of CO2. It's also the reason why we even need carbon management in the first place, because nature is too slow. Now, the second part of this is that, and this is hopefully pretty intuitive, but is that if carbon escapes from storage, it simply is pollution once again, right? So it will just continue to cause climate change. Now, the duration of storage, what it does is that it delays climate change from when the carbon comes out again. So this is what this graph is showing, right? So we see global warming, and then the different lines are the different global warming scenarios that happen with different durations of storage. So for example, if we have carbon storage that basically captures CO2, stores it for just 1 year and releases it, and that's all we did, we would have this red warming scenario. If we have 100-year, it gets a little lower. If we have 1,000 years, it's almost flat, but as you can see, it's still rising. And if we have what we call permanent CDR, now we have completely flat and temperatures coming down. So the point here is that the longer we can store carbon, the better. Now, the problem with that is that what I've been showing you is just the physical nature of carbon storage. Now we actually need to socially make a decision of how long is long enough. And this decision is embedded in the standards. The standards decide this amount of years is long enough and we will call it quits. And what my student and I published on last year, or earlier this year actually, is that we did this investigation of what do the standards actually decide on? And what you can see is that most of them say that 100 years is long enough. And many more say that much less than that is fine. And only 2 standards actually say 1,000 years is long enough. But as we've just seen, even 1,000 years is very short, climatically speaking. Now, how does this translate into actual projects, right? Because there's often a bit of a mismatch between what the standards say and what actually happens. And what we can see in this analysis is that we looked at the proposals that were made to Microsoft in 2021 and 2022. They received, I think, something like 150 or maybe 200 proposals for carbon removal. And what is novel about that data set is that Microsoft actually asked every applicant to say, how long are you going to keep the carbon stored for? And so what I'm plotting here is the cumulative total of all the proposals in terms of CO2 and how long they say they will keep the carbon stored for. And what we can see is that within 30 years, Microsoft would have lost already 50% of that carbon. So what this means is that the durability, the sustainability, I guess, of the global carbon management system is very short. Right? If this is what the whole world does for carbon management, within 30 years, we will have to do it again. Right? And now I have a high school student, actually, Matank, who's been helping me compile an enormous data set of every single project that has been sold worldwide to see what is the global sustainability of this carbon management system. So I don't have the answer right now, but I'm guessing it's going to be very short. Now, this is the point where I'm going to tell you what I think about all of this. And this is in a paper that I've been trying to publish for quite a few years and has been meeting some resistance. But what I'm arguing is that if we care about the future, if we care about the well-being of future generations, whether that be humans or other species, and if we care about making the polluter pay for the waste that they have produced, and if we care about stopping climate change and getting to net zero, then we need to rethink how we are defining permanence. What this graph is showing in a simplistic manner is where different agents, different actors in the carbon management space define this, how long is long enough. The experts say it's long enough if it's greater than 10 years. The carbon markets say anywhere between 1 year and 100. The DOE, Department of Energy, has been flip-flopping between 100 years and 999 years. And now they don't even have anything. Corporate buyers actually want 1,000 years. And what I'm suggesting is that to be climate relevant, we should be thinking about technologies that are 10,000 years and greater. Now, there's a lot of questions that come up with that, and I'd be happy to talk about them maybe as a discussion, but I won't raise them here. Okay, so to wrap up, I have a few slides about where I think this whole enterprise of carbon management is going. And the first one is with this question of who is going to lead this. The US was the world leader on carbon management, both in terms of projects, but also in terms of government spending and research development. But the government has decided to shift priorities. And so that is likely to cede the leadership to other countries that are not far behind. So right now we're seeing a lot of action in Europe, especially with their new regulation that's coming in, where they are trying to implement carbon management into their emission trading scheme. And if they succeed, this would be enormous. But also Asia, China is really, really advanced in their carbon management technology, and especially in their expenditure. Now, that's not to say that the states within the US could not continue to lead, but this does raise questions about the place of the US in space. Now, there is also the question of, well, could industry just step in? And there is some evidence that this might be happening, but whether it would happen at the scale that would keep the lead, I'm not sure. The other aspect to think about is the workforce, because this carbon management industry is not going to run by itself. It actually is going to need tremendous amounts of people manning the system in various ways. Some of the research has been suggesting that up to 100,000 jobs could be created in the US over the next few decades through a commitment to carbon management. And of course, there's geographic variations, and of course, it may not be congruent with the fossil fuel losses, the jobs in fossil fuel that we could be expected. And who is going to be training the people working in this space? And there are only a few universities and labs in the US currently providing that platform. Right now, opposition to carbon management is low, but so is public awareness. And this, for now, is a good benefit to try and set up a system that will be efficient and also equitable, but we may not be able to count on that for very long. And public awareness and information engagement are going to be quite important. Because at the end of the day, we need to move beyond public acceptance. We need to not just accept it, but we need to have people and communities who embrace this, right? Otherwise, we will have NIMBYism and we will have the blockage of this industry. And how do we get there, I think, is an enormous question to be answered. And I hope the interdisciplinary nature of carbon management will bring in more social science, more investigation of, is this even possible? Where do we do this in the most responsible way? And how do we share all of the benefits and reduce the risk? Just a few other things that are necessary for this industry to work, but we're talking about enormous investment in research and development still, because everything is still too expensive. Everything is still using too much energy. We don't know the risk on a lot of these technologies, so we need to be investigating this in depth. We need a lot of coordination and collaboration to standardize carbon accounting and carbon measurement. And I'm involved in a movement that started by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US to try and get people to at least talk about what is necessary to standardize, what should be part of the standardization process. As I mentioned, we also need continued effort to inform and engage with communities meaningfully in order to share benefits, reduce risk, and also train this workforce. And we need to involve decision makers, because at the end of the day, as I've been trying to show you, this carbon management industry does not rest solely on volunteers. We actually need regulation. So how do we get regulators to think about energy policy in a different way? And with that, thank you very much, and I'll take questions.